You don't become fluent in English by memorizing rules. You become fluent when you allow yourself to speak without permission from fear. The moment you stop asking yourself, "Is my grammar perfect?" and start asking, "Can I express myself clearly?" that is the moment your journey begins. English speaking is not a subject, it is a skill of courage. And courage is not about having no fear. It is about speaking even when your voice shakes inside your mind. Many people know English, they understand it, they read it. But when it comes to speaking, their confidence disappears. Why? Because they are waiting for perfection. But perfection is a trap that keeps you silent. Building confidence in English, speaking begins from a very simple but deeply uncomfortable truth that most people already understand the language more than they are willing to admit. Yet they remain silent because they are waiting for a version of themselves that never makes mistakes, and that version never arrives. So the voice stays locked inside the mind where it feels safe but powerless. And the real shift begins the moment a person decides that speaking is not about being correct, but about being courageous. Because confidence is not something that appears before action. It is something that is born inside action. And when someone starts speaking without stopping to judge every word, they begin to notice that their mind has been overprotecting them for years, creating fear where there was only learning needed, and the fear of making mistakes becomes larger than the mistake itself. Even though mistakes are actually the most natural part of learning any language, just like a child learns their first words through repetition, confusion, correction, and continuous attempt without shame. But adults forget this simplicity and start measuring themselves with perfection. And this is where confidence breaks, not because they lack ability, but because they lack permission from themselves to be imperfect. And when a person finally gives themselves that permission, even if the sentences are broken or slow or uncertain, something starts to change in their inner voice, because speaking out loud trains the brain differently than thinking silently. It forces clarity, it builds familiarity, and it slowly reduces the pressure of translation that happens in the mind when someone tries to move from their native language into English word by word. And instead of that slow process, the mind begins to recognize patterns, common phrases, and natural flow. But this only happens when speaking is consistent and unfiltered, without stopping every few seconds to correct or restart or feel embarrassed. And confidence grows in those moments where a person continues even after a mistake, not before it. Because before speaking there is only imagination, but during speaking there is experience, and experience is what rewires belief. So when someone practices speaking freely for even a short time every day, especially when they allow themselves to talk about simple things like their surroundings, their thoughts, their feelings, or their plans, without preparing perfect sentences in advance, they slowly begin to realize that English is not an exam, but a tool. Not a performance, but a habit of expression. And in that realization, fear starts losing its control, because fear survives on hesitation. And hesitation weakens when speech becomes continuous, even if imperfect. And the mind starts adjusting itself to this new pattern where mistakes are normal and silence is no longer a safe option. And in that process, a strange kind of strength develops, not the loud kind of confidence that depends on perfection, but a quiet confidence that comes from trying again and again without waiting for approval. And this confidence does not need validation because it is built through action, and every attempt becomes evidence that the person is capable of expressing themselves beyond fear. beyond judgment, beyond the inner criticism that used to stop them before they even started speaking. And over time, the need to translate everything slowly disappears because the brain begins to store English expressions as direct thoughts instead of converted sentences. And this shift makes speaking feel lighter, more natural, less forced. And even when mistakes still happen, they no longer break the flow. They simply become part of the rhythm of speaking. And in that rhythm, the person starts discovering that fluency is not a destination, but a continuous movement where confidence is not something to achieve once, but something to practice repeatedly every moment they choose to speak. Instead of saying silent improving fluency through continuous speaking practice is not about voting on more parry or memorizing long grammar rules, memorizing long grammar rules. It is about training the mouth, the mind, and the thought process to work together without hesitation, because fluency is not stored in books. It is stored in repetition, and repetition only becomes powerful when it is active, not passive. And speaking continuously creates a mental environment where English stops feeling like a subject and starts becoming a natural response system, where words begin to arrive without heavy translation. But this shift does not happen instantly. It develops slowly through uncomfortable beginnings, where a person feels unsure, pauses often, and struggles to form complete sentences. Yet those very moments are the foundation of fluency, because every pause shows the brain where improvement is needed. And every attempt shows the brain that communication is possible even without perfection. And when someone commits to speaking for a longer duration without stopping, even if it is just talking to themselves, describing daily life, expressing thoughts aloud, or narrating simple actions, the brain starts adapting to the pressure of continuous output. And this pressure is important because it forces the mind to stop relying on silence as a safety space and instead pushes it into active construction of language, where ideas must be shaped into words in real time. And this real time processing is what gradually builds fluency, not short bursts of practice followed by long breaks, but steady flow where the mind learns endurance in language use. And during this process, mistakes naturally appear, sometimes in grammar, sometimes in vocabulary choice, sometimes in sentence structure. But instead of stopping for correction every time, continuous speaking teaches a different habit, which is to keep going despite errors. Because stopping repeatedly breaks the flow and strengthens fear, while continuing strengthens confidence and adaptability. And over time, the brain begins to recognize patterns of English sentences not as separate rules, but as familiar structures. And this familiarity reduces the mental effort required to speak. And what once felt like a struggle slowly becomes automatic. And this automation is the core of fluency, where a person does not need to consciously translate each thought, but can directly express ideas as they form. And this ability develops only when speaking is not occasional, but constant, even if the topics are simple or repetitive. Because repetition is not weakness in practice, it is reinforcement. And through reinforcement, the mind builds stronger pathways for expression. And another important aspect of continuous speaking is that it trains emotional control, because many learners feel nervous, embarrassed, or overly self-critical while speaking. But when they continue speaking for longer periods, these emotions lose intensity as the focus shifts from fear of judgment to flow of expression. And gradually the inner critic becomes quieter because it no longer interrupts every sentence. And the speaker starts to experience a sense of movement in language, where thoughts are not trapped, but flowing outward. And this flow creates confidence that is not dependent on external correction or approval, but on internal experience of being able to express oneself without stopping. And even when the language is simple, the act of continuous speaking strengthens communication more than complex preparation ever could, because fluency is not measured by difficulty of words, but by ease of delivery. And ease of delivery only comes when the mind has practiced sustained output enough times to remove hesitation. And this is why speaking for longer durations, even alone, even imperfectly, even without structure, becomes a powerful tool, because it mirrors real communication where there is no pause button. And through this practice, the speaker gradually develops a natural rhythm in speech, where ideas connect more smoothly, sentences form more quickly, and confidence builds not from knowing everything, but from being able to continue regardless of uncertainty, training the mind to think in English instead of translating from the native language is one of the deepest transformations in language learning. Because translation is not just a habit, it is a mental delay, a constant interruption between thought and expression, where every idea must pass through two systems before it becomes speech. And this creates hesitation, confusion, and a feeling of being slow even when the person actually knows enough words. And the real progress begins when a learner starts to break this bridge of translation and allows thoughts to form directly in English, even if those thoughts are simple at first, because fluency is not about complexity in the beginning. It is about direct connection between mind and language. And this connection is built gradually through repeated exposure and active use, not through memorization alone. And when someone continues practicing speaking, reading, or even thinking aloud in English without stopping to convert every sentence from their native language, the brain slowly starts to recognize English patterns as natural structures rather than foreign codes. And this recognition changes everything, because instead of searching for word-by-word translation, the mind begins to retrieve ready-made phrases and sentence patterns that have been used before, and this reduces mental load significantly, making speech more fluid and less forced. But this shift requires patience, because the brain initially resists this change. It feels uncomfortable to think directly in another language. It feels incomplete or uncertain. And many learners mistake this discomfort as inability, when in reality it is simply adaptation in progress. And every attempt to stay in English thought, even for a few seconds longer than usual, strengthens this new mental pathway. And over time, the inner dialogue begins to shift, where instead of thinking in native language first and then converting, a person starts to describe their surroundings, emotions, and ideas directly in English inside their mind. And this internal shift is powerful, because speaking externally becomes easier when thinking internally is already aligned. And when a person practices speaking without translating, especially during simple activities like describing what they are doing, what they see, or what they feel, the mind slowly learns to associate experiences directly with English words, and this association builds speed, and speed builds confidence, and confidence removes hesitation. But the most important part is consistency, because occasional practice keeps translation alive, while continuous practice weakens it. And as translation weakens, clarity increases, and sentences begin to form more naturally without deliberate effort. And mistakes still occur, but they no longer interrupt the flow of thought, because the mind is no longer dependent on perfect structure before speaking. It becomes flexible, adaptive, and willing to express even incomplete ideas. And this flexibility is what creates real communication ability, not perfect grammar in isolation. And as this thinking pattern develops, the learner begins to notice that English words start appearing in their mind without searching, sometimes as full phrases, sometimes as fragments that still carry meaning. And this spontaneous appearance is a sign that the brain is shifting from translation mode to thinking mode. And in this stage, learning becomes less about effort and more about presence, where language is not a task to complete, but a medium through which thoughts naturally flow. And even silence becomes different, because the mind is no longer blocked by conversion steps. It becomes ready to express instantly when needed. And this readiness is what defines fluency at a deeper level. Not just speaking ability, but mental alignment with the language itself, developing natural communication through self-expression. And consistency begins when a learner stops treating English as a performance and starts treating it as a personal space of expression where thoughts are allowed to exist freely without judgment. Because communication is not built in silence and observation alone. It is built in repetition of speaking, even when the speaker feels unprepared. And this process starts when a person chooses to express themselves daily without waiting for the perfect moment, perfect vocabulary, or perfect grammar, and instead allows their inner thoughts to take shape in words as they are, simple, imperfect, and real. Because natural communication is not about sounding like a textbook. It is about sounding like a human being who is trying to connect ideas. And consistency plays a very important role in this transformation, because skills do not grow through intensity alone. They grow through repetition over time. And when someone practices speaking regularly, even for short periods, the brain begins to recognize communication as a normal activity rather than a stressful event. And this normalization reduces fear, hesitation, and overthinking. And slowly the learner starts noticing that words come more easily than before, not because they suddenly became smarter, but because their mind has been trained to respond instead of pause. And self-expression becomes the key. Because when a person speaks about their own life, their thoughts, their surroundings, and their emotions, the language becomes meaningful, and meaning helps memory, and memory helps fluency. And this connection between personal experience and language creates a strong foundation where English is no longer seen as something external or distant, but as a tool that belongs to their daily thinking. And as this habit continues, the learner begins to trust their own voice more, even when mistakes appear, because mistakes no longer interrupt communication. They become part of it, and communication remains alive as long as expression continues. And this is where consistency shows its true power, because even imperfect daily practice builds stronger results than occasional perfect effort. And over time, the speaker begins to develop rhythm in their speech, where sentences flow more naturally, pauses become shorter, and ideas connect more smoothly, not because they memorized fixed patterns, but because they have repeated the act of forming thoughts into words so many times that it becomes automatic. And natural communication is not created in a single moment of success. It is built in countless small moments of trying again, where each attempt adds a layer of confidence, and each repetition reduces fear, and self-expression strengthens identity, because the speaker begins to see themselves as someone who can communicate, not someone who is trying to learn how to communicate. And this shift in identity is powerful because it changes behavior. And behavior determines progress. And as consistency continues, even thinking starts to align with speaking. where inner thoughts become more structured in English and expression becomes faster, and this alignment reduces the gap between thought and speech, making communication smoother and more instinctive. And even in difficult moments when the right word is not available, the speaker learns to continue with whatever they can express instead of stopping completely. And this ability to continue is what keeps communication natural, because real conversation is not about perfection. It is about flow. And flow only exists when the speaker trusts themselves enough to keep going without fear of judgment. And through this ongoing practice, communication becomes less of a skill being learned and more of a natural extension of personality, where speaking feels like sharing rather than performing, and consistency ensures that this transformation does not fade, but strengthens with time, making self-expression a permanent part of how the person interacts with language and the world around them.